Cultivating Calmness Podcast. Thank you for joining me today. It is the first day in November for my podcast. And so we are starting off by talking about Children's Grief Awareness Month. That is correct. It is a month totally dedicated to children's grief, and that's because they don't often get noticed. They kind of get overlooked, or can. I think there is a lot more attention given to children now related to grief and the grief that they may be experiencing, but that has not always been the case. And I obviously have a personal connection to children's grief, and that's why I want to talk about it today and a little bit about it this month. As if you follow me at all, I read children's books on Thursdays. I call it Therapy Book Thursday. And so this month, I think it'll be 4 different books that I'll be reading will be on children's grief, specifically books that I have not read before. So I have read a decent amount of children's grief specific books on here. So they are all on my page, where you can find all my therapy books that I have read, and you can get those, the books that I've read, on my Amazon lists, as well as other books that I recommend and other products and things that I think are helpful for therapy and for holistic living. But for this month and for today, I really wanted to just focus on a particular aspect of grieving. And this may not relate specifically to children. It can, but also to just grief in general. And this could be parents who are grieving the loss of a child. It could be children who are grieving the loss of a friend, a sibling, a parent, or anybody else. It really doesn't matter who you're grieving. This can relate to anybody. And that's just the idea of kind of the unfinished life, or the untold, unfinished stories that we hold. So for me, this comes up when I think about my mom. My mom died when she was 35, so pretty young. Obviously not a child who has a lot more that they could experience, but to me, she still had a lot of life to live, and she missed out on raising my siblings and she missed out on all of our graduations and big moments. And for my sister especially, she was a little over 2.5 when my mom died, so she missed a lot of firsts for my sister. And my sister missed having her in her life for those things as well. Missed getting to see us graduate, getting to see us all married and have our first and second children. And that is something that we grieve, not only having her in our lives to be there for us when we experience those things, but also just grieving that for her, that she didn't get to experience that. She didn't get to celebrate her wedding anniversary with our dad, and didn't get to have her own moments and her own celebrations. And whether that was with her career or her motherhood or with her family, lots of experiences that she didn't get to experience. And a lot of people think about these things when it comes to grief, and that can bring up its own set of emotions and experiences and memories, and even just that idea of potential memories. So when you think about maybe a child that has died, you think about, as you get to certain ages, you think about, how my child would be X, Y, and Z years old today, and what would they be doing at this age? Would they be talking or walking or writing or having a boyfriend or getting married or having babies? When somebody loses a child, that grief doesn't just end when they have another child, or when they it appears from all angles that maybe they are over it. We're never over our grief. We just learn to live with our grief. We learn to incorporate our grief into our lives. And that's where, your friends and yourself maybe, who are experiencing some form of grief, may feel like you're doing really well, and then all of a sudden you may be hit with something. And that's okay, because you have never been here today. this is the first time you're experiencing today. You've never been here before. You may have had similar experiences, but you've never been here before. You've never been under these specific and unique circumstances. And so when you're hit with that grief, it doesn't mean that you're not over it. It doesn't mean that you haven't healed. It doesn't mean any of that. What it does mean is that you are seeing your grief, you are seeing your loss from that angle today in this moment, which is a different angle than you saw it yesterday in yesterday's moments. That's something I try to get my clients to think about and remember, is that people will come to me at a certain place in time to work on, whether it's trauma or grief, whether it has nothing to do with a loss of a person or something in their lives, but just because you haven't, you are experiencing some kind of reaction doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you or that you aren't doing something right because you are having an emotional connection to a person who is no longer here and maybe it's been a long time. That's okay. Every experience is unique to you, and you are learning to incorporate that into your life, and each day is a new day in your life. So when it comes to the grieving process, it's ever growing, ever learning, ever changing. I like to picture grief as a bookshelf. And you imagine, when the day grief hits you, and sometimes we have that grief that comes on, that anticipatory grief. So, you expect something to change, or you're expecting somebody to die, and you're planning for that. And so you're anticipating that loss. But that, that day that loss actually happens, it's like you're starting with a clean bookshelf, and the only thing on that bookshelf is that massive grief book. And it feels like that's the only thing you can cope with and the only thing that you can focus on at that point in your life. And what we hope to have happen for you is that, that book is going to stay on the shelf and the book isn't going to change. But what is going to change is everything else on that shelf. That we're going to start to add books to the shelf. We're going to start to add the knickknacks to the shelf. We're going to add the pictures and the collectibles and, more books and more books and more books. And, eventually when you go and look back at your bookshelf, it's not going to be just that big, thick grief book sitting there, but it's going to be full of life and full of lessons learned, hard days, good days, happy, sad moments. And they're all going to be there mixed in, and mixed in with that is going to be that grief book. It didn't go away. It didn't shrink, but it incorporated itself into your life. You incorporated your life with your grief. So now when you look at your shelf, it's not just the grief that I'm experiencing, right? It is everything else, that goes along with it. And it makes that grief not be as hard as it used to be. It doesn't make it not hard at all. For some people, that may be the case, and that's okay. For others, it is, everybody's process is different. What we don't want to see happen is you being kind of stuck in that grief, that you are, it's like that person isn't gone and you're trying to, it feels like maybe they're just missing and they're going to come back, and that yearning, and that is part of the grieving process. But if that continues for years later, we would fall into a different category of grief, and that's more of a complicated grief system. And we would want to help you to be able to work through that and work that complication kind of out, to be able to live without that person and recognize that they aren't here and they're not coming back, and that is sad and that is hard, and you are worth living for, and you're worth having a better life and to doing things with that book, right? With that carrying on into your new life without them here, present physically in your life. So I like sharing things and aspects of grief or just life or trauma that maybe you haven't considered. So when you are faced with a family member or a friend or a student or fill in the blank who has had someone close to them die, this is one of those things to think about. What are they worried that their parent maybe is missing out on? what are they thinking about in relation to their person not being there for big events in their life? Are they thinking about that? It's probably not something they're necessarily sharing. Growing up, especially within the first couple years, one of the big pieces, I know I felt, and this is not related to that untold story piece, but is related to feeling alone. It can feel very isolating, like nobody knows what I'm experiencing. And in the school that I attended a small private school for many years, and I only knew of one other person who had a parent die. And that person, I think their parent was more involved in the school, and, was pretty well known. And so that person ended up getting what I deemed to be a lot of attention for their parent dying. And meanwhile, I felt like I didn't get any of that special attention. Not that I needed the special attention, but it felt, it felt isolating. It felt like othered, that they, people recognize that as being something important, and maybe that it didn't really get viewed as important for me. Now at the time, we hadn't been involved in this school. We actually started school at our school like 5 days after my mom died. So we hadn't been there before, and so that maybe had a lot to do with it. And if there were other kids who had parents die, we weren't aware of it. So it's possible that other kids had parents die, who attended that school, and we weren't, aware. And that happens often. There are probably many people that surround you who've had people really close to them die that you don't know anything about, especially if it wasn't something that happened while you knew them. If you knew them, you may be made aware just because of circumstances and what's happening. But if it happened while, before you met them, which, I met a lot of new people, and moving from a private school to a public school, nobody in the public school knew anything about me, and they learned through experience when it would come up. If somebody would make a joke and it upset me, they would find out real quick why it upset me. And that's how people found out. And I bet there are probably people, who I graduated high school with who had no idea that, my mom had died when I was much younger. Just like I said, I probably had classmates who had something similar happen who I had no knowledge of. And that's why it can feel very isolating, as with any topic. It could be depression or PTSD or, any diagnosis you can think of. Those experiences you can feel very alone in them. So it's important to educate, talk about it, share about it. If you're a teacher, to be aware that what's going on in your students' lives, so that you can kind of have an idea of why they may be behaving the way they are, why they interact with people the way that they do, because it could be related to something that's going on in their home or going on in their lives. And having that understanding will help you to be able to teach them better and work with them better. And the same goes for any profession or any interaction that you have with somebody, especially kids who may be facing grief this month and any month. But as you know, it's the beginning of November and we are heading into the holidays. We just obviously had Halloween, so Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Christmas, and others that people may be celebrating. And think about that when you're thinking about people who are grieving. Holidays can be a very difficult time because they're used to being around their friends and their family, and that's just a difficult experience to go without. And to think about sharing those, not being able to share those memories with their person anymore. So I hope you learned something new today, gave you something else to consider when interacting with people who are grieving. Thank you for joining me. And just remember, it is Children's Grief Awareness Month. You can keep an eye out on my social media for some of that information. And I will see you again next week.